delivery units, its role during the crisis. The chat will be mainly in Spanish, and we do have simultaneous interpretation available into English and Portuguese.
Please click on the world icon at the bottom of the screen and choose the language. Para português, por favor, faça clique no ícone do mundo na parte inferior da pantalla. Mi nombre es Mariano Lafuente.
My name is Mariano Lafuente. I'm a specialist in public management at the IDB, and I coordinate government centers through which, from the IDB, we've had a chance to support several delivery units in the region in its creation and implementation. This cycle of delivery units is the first of a series of webinars on public management, which we'll be developing in the next few weeks. Today, we have three truly exceptional panelists I'd like to introduce, whom we have from Colombia, Brazil, and United States. Alejandra Botero, who's the President Advisor for Management and Delivery in the Presidency of Colombia. Raquel Flecha, Director of Strategic Management in the Executive Secretariat of the Economics Ministry in Brazil, and Dustin Brown, Deputy Assistant Director for Management of the OMB in the Executive Office of the President. Furthermore, we have Lea Jimenez, who will also be participating. She's Division Head for Innovation to serve the citizen in the IDB, under which Public Management and Government Centers is. And we'll also have, at the end, comments from Edgardo Mosqueira, who's the Clusters Coordinator for Public Management at the IDB. In a few minutes, we will also include the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We ask you that you send your questions, which will be taken at the end of the session, in that icon, and please indicate your name and the institution. To begin, I'm going to invite Lea Jimenez to say a few opening words. Thank you very much, Mariano, and good morning to all of you. It's really an honor for me to be here virtually with you and to have this opportunity to welcome our panelists today, as well as our special guests and all who've joined us to analyze the role of delivery units with us, as well as the management models in this crisis. Firstly, I'd like to thank the panelists for accepting to participate. I know that your work agendas are overloaded, and especially now as a result of all the challenges you're facing in the decision-making levels. With this chat, I want you to know that you are contributing to work with the regional public good, and I want to thank you very much for that. I'd also like to congratulate Alejandra and Raquel for leading the delivery units and for contributing to gender parity in your respective governments in the region and in this panel. One of the messages the crisis has taught us is the importance of having a working public sector capable of planning and implementing policies quickly, capable of coordinating between the different sector areas, and also vertically with the different government levels. The crisis clearly has shown us the importance of having governments capable of being effective in reaching results and being most efficient in the use of its resources more than ever. To achieve effective governments, to serve the citizen, the role of the government center, as you know, is really critical. It is the brain, it's the coordinator of the government, ordering the interventions of all sectors involved, using routines that will facilitate production and updating of data, and overcomes obstacles so that the implementers can execute and so for things to happen. The government center has played a fundamental role in the response to the crisis on health issues, as well as in the economic reactivation. In the government center agenda, one of the key tools has been the delivery units. These delivery units have been very important in Latin America and the Caribbean in recent years as key tools to improve management of government priorities. And that has led to a very large expansion in the use of this tool from the IDB. We've been fortunate to have been able to follow in the establishment of these delivery units in more than 15 governments since 2013, and we've learned a great deal from these experiences. Two of these experiences are represented here today in our panel. Also, on this road, we've learned a lot about more advanced governments in this agenda, like those in the United States. So we want to thank Dustin for being here with us, for never abandoning us, and also the United Kingdom. In these years, the region has managed to reduce the problems created by the implementation and adapted the methodology of the delivery unit to the idiosyncrasies of each country, and has implemented them with government centers in subnational governments, and in some cases, the delivery units have participated directly in the response to the crisis, particularly in reconstruction efforts like Chile after the earthquake in 2010, the reconstruction of Peru after the El Nino phenomenon in 2017, and the reconstruction of Bahamas after the recent hurricane last year. Under enormous crisis circumstances like now, many governments have had to face the delivery units' use for government centers, their raison d'etre, or to take part of their time to deal with more important issues at the time, and in some cases, critical issues and multi-sectorial, like the economic reactivation at this time. And this is really not an easy decision. Thinking of this within the framework of the crisis, it was very interesting for us from the IDB and for many of the practitioners and experts in the region who are connected with us today to see firsthand how these delivery units are working and to learn from their experiences from the IDB and in particular from the innovation to serve the citizens division. We are truly committed to support governments of Latin America and the Caribbean to strengthen these delivery units. And I'm sure that this webinar will contribute to that goal and that we'll learn a great deal from our panelists. I want to thank you all and once again, welcome. Thank you. And now we're going to give the floor to the conversation with our panelists. We have 3 rounds of questions for them. For the first 2 questions, you'll have 5 minutes to answer, 3 minutes for the last one, and then we're going to have, as I said before, comments from Edgardo, and then the question and answers from the public. We'll begin then with Alejandra Botero from Colombia. Alejandra, welcome and thank you for being with us. Maybe to begin, it would be really interesting to hear from you the mandate of the management and delivery group that was created end of 2019 and how its role has evolved during the crisis. Thank you very much, Mariano. And thank you, of course, to the IDB, and thank you, Leah, for your introductory words. And of course, it's a pleasure to share this panel with Dustin and Raquel. Mariano, Dustin, and Edgardo, in a way, have been co-founders of this management. So it's really a pleasure for me to be able to share our trajectory and how far we've come since the year and a half since we last met to see how we could set up this advisory group, how it's evolved, and what's the mandate, you asked me, Mariano. Well, let me see. We, from the very beginning, and this has been a tremendous challenge, wanted to structure a counseling unit that could, because Colombia has followed different exercises in follow-up units, but this government, for the first time, dedicates or structures a counseling unit for this particular purpose alone, counseling reporting directly to the president with that periscopic and cross-cutting vision for all other sectors. The mandate we have and the objective that we want to set up in the capacity strengthening is to identify the priorities that, because of their very nature, must be complex priorities, priorities requiring a great coordination, a tremendous level of intersectorial coordination with an impact on a large number of Colombians, or at least the most vulnerable. That was the way we identified what we called the transformational priorities. And what we're doing is trying to set up the best practices to identify those initiatives, as we've already done, and set up the tools in order to do an effective follow-up. What we've done as a result, at least in this last year and a half, and the IDB has helped us tremendously, is to identify best practices from other delivery units in the world to apply to the Colombian context. And the Colombian context, for example, by its very nature, is one that has a very high level of regulations. It is one where there are many similar units. There's a national planning department, for example, which is not necessarily the same in other countries. So we have to adapt and complement the national planning unit and not duplicate the activities. The way in which we've worked, and this is just to tell you a bit of what we've done, the National Planning Department follows up the whole development plan of the country, almost 675 initiatives. And then what we do now is follow up only 60 of those. So we've managed to fine tune it. At one point we had 150 or 200 initiatives, and we've fine tuned it so that we now follow up only about 10% of the government plan. They follow up with a traffic light, with figures which are certified because it's a very transparent figure, which is called synergy, and it follows up the 675, but only as an indicator of the results. What we've done together with the IDB and with UNDP that's also helped us, and with the experts that we've hired, identified a prospective situation where one of the components is the results or the outcomes, and the other is a measurement of the activities or the work plan that we're trying to achieve to actually identify the bottlenecks, the red dots, and to make sure that that results traffic light is not in red and not have to do an ex post analysis, but that we try to be able to analyze ex ante what's actually happening. Right now, and that has been the added value of our counseling unit, we have a recognition of all the sectors where we report to the president and the cabinet what these initiatives are like. And that gives us certain validity or credibility in order to do the actual follow-up. Sometimes it's almost face to face because some initiatives might not work, but we're seeing, as I said, a counseling unit that has the ability to report to the president and the cabinet what's happening. The follow-up tools that we have at this time are monthly reports to the president of about 40, 50 pages of how each initiative is doing, where we add the progress, the alerts, and the proposals to solve the alerts. The report is validated. Each initiative is validated with the respective ministers, not that we are sending a report. No, we validate that with the ministers, and then together with the report where you add the fine-tuned details, let's say, we follow up with the president and we talk to him in about 10 and 15 minutes to tell him what's happening. And when there's a meeting of the cabinet, which has been suspended during the pandemic, but when we did have meetings with the ministers, we reported with all the ministers. Now what we're doing it is reporting to the president, the head of the cabinet, and the chief of staff. So this is more or less how we've evolved as the counseling unit, and we've had tremendous challenges from now until 2022. The IDB has helped us with a sovereign credit of $15 million, and the purpose of this, half is to set up an effective information system to give the transparency and the traceability, so that when the next president comes, he doesn't have to go from scratch and try to see what are the poverty initiatives, what's been done, or who are the past officers, but that he has a record of what's been done in the last government years. And it will be traceable, and it will help us take advantage of all the very rich in information and the initiatives in order to do a data analysis, analyze the georeferential information. So this part of the component is very important. And the other thing we want to do is to display all the capacities developed in the presidency at the level of all ministries. And I believe that that would be probably one of the most important added values of this council unit, which we hope will be our legacy. I think I answered the question. I think I answered the third question you asked me, but anyway. No, that's okay. Thank you, Ali. I'll ask you the question again afterwards. But thank you. That was an excellent summary. Thank you very much, and congratulations. Raquel.
Okay. La delivery unit del Ministerio de Economía.
The delivery unit of the Ministry of Economics should be the one, probably the youngest of the delivery units family in their region. And I think that it would be very interesting because it's a sector one. It's in the ministry, and maybe it's not as common in the region. And its focus has been the response to the crisis, to the pandemic. Tell us a little bit what you're doing, what you're working with, and what your experience has been.
Thank you so much, Mariano. I thank you, Ale, Alejandro, Dustin. So I believe it is important to define our answer in two ways. What are the main measures of the economy ministry, and how are we working, trying to implement some of those measures? The Minister of Economy right now works in three main pillars to provide answers for the pandemic. The first pillar, I would say, which is to provide assistance for the vulnerable population. And the main measure that has been adopted, which is our emergency plan, where we, through 3 years, now we are going, expanding this, we are giving 600 reais to part of the vulnerable population of Brazil, those that live mainly out of the informal economic sector of Brazil, which has no way to work right now. We have other measures, but I'm just defining the main one. The second pillar, I would say, which is try to preserve the job and the income. And in this particular pillar, we have a measure that we consider very important, which we call emergency benefit, which we are trying to define, for instance, measures that might reduce some type of workload, and as well the salary, so that the worker will not have such a huge loss. The Brazilian government proportionally will try with the insurance benefit. So there is a defined period, and we are also working to see extend that time, to try to extend that time because of the pandemic. So it is really important to mention that we have other measures to finish with the red tape, or try to alleviate the red tape for medium and small business. And the third pillar, I would say, which is to fight the pandemic, if you will. And it is important to note in this particular aspect, which is a cash transfer or resource transfer to states and municipalities within the federative regime of Brazil. And then we have to say the universal health system that we have in Brazil and the universal social system. Not only those, but also trying in a way to provide some compensations due to the lack of income from the states and municipalities in Brazil. So within those three areas, which I believe are the main one, we created an inventory of 170
measures that were taken by the Ministry of Economy in very short time period. Now, many of these measures required that we stay abreast of their development very closely. Because for them, it was necessary for there to be an action plan for the implementation, or we had to come up with indicators to ascertain whether the impact desired by this policy actually played out and translated into effectiveness in its execution. So we have from 25 to 30 measures each week. We see that each measure has a life cycle over a couple of weeks. I can give you an example of that. One of the measures, which was for what we call the 13th salary. Now, this was something that was very well defined, and we monitored the disbursement of these funds. It leaves the aegis of the delivery units and goes under the investment aegis, and then we offer guarantees for small and mid-sized companies and micro companies that are taking loans, and that is a large measure that falls under our scope of monitoring. And so we have these different measures that we do have to follow very closely, monitor very closely. Now, in this monitoring process, we have weekly routines that we follow. We use different techniques, and what we're trying to do is to identify stumbling blocks, difficulties that arise so that we can come up with a solution for these problems, and that this will feed the decision-making process within the Ministry of the Economy. And not only that, but to stay abreast of the evolution of these performance indicators. And starting with that, in this weekly cycle of monitoring, we also do some curating, so to speak, in which we seek three overarching results. The first result is sent to the Executive Secretary of the Ministry of the Economy to focus on obstacles in which we provide inputs for the decision-making process within the Executive Secretariat of the Ministry of the Economy. So these are different aspects that need to be addressed for us to actually push forward those measures. Now, there's another package, which is outreach or social communication. And this is from the standpoint of governance and management. And then we have the outside communication aspect. So we have to see what the progress made during that week was, and we make that again available to the Communications Secretariat. And the third large package of measures is that goes to all the specialized secretariats. This is a very large ministry with different areas of responsibility. It's very important for everyone to know exactly what measures are being taken by the others across the board. And so there are focal points in all these different specialized areas of the Secretariat to which we send this updated information for everyone to stay abreast. And this is what the delivery unit within the Ministry of the Economy does in Brazil. Thank you very much. That was very
And the
interesting
way
how
you
you
adapted
adapted
the
that
methodology with a very dynamic
methodology.
portfolio. Very interesting. Thank you very much. And my congratulations for all you've done.
Spanish now. Primero, como dijo Lea, muchas gracias por todo el apoyo que le has venido dando.
Thank you, Lea, and thank you very much for the support you've been giving the regions, often supported by the IDB in promoting the performance models and the government centers and delivery units. Actually, you've made a tremendous difference for many countries. Dustin, though the federal government of the United States doesn't actually have a delivery unit, a centralized delivery unit as such, you do have a performance framework which is institutionalized and has been there for years, where there are these models, but vertically in each ministry, with a coordinated networks of COBs in the presidency where you are. How did this management model work during the coronavirus crisis, and what has been the work of these performance units within the framework of the crisis?
Great. Thank you, Mariano, for the invitation to be with everyone today. It's great to be back with my colleagues in the IADB. Leah, wonderful to be reconnected with you. Great to meet Raquel and Alejandra. Wonderful to be reconnected. Honestly, working with you and Mariano and Eduardo in the Colombia experience over the past couple of years has been a real highlight for me, both professionally and personally. So wonderful to see the progress you've been able to make in a very short period of time, and look forward to staying connected. So yeah, thank you for the question, Mariano. As just maybe a few minutes of background that may be helpful. The performance framework that you mentioned had its roots originally in 1993 with our Government Performance and Results Act that established basically a series of planning and reporting routines, mostly annual, by our agencies. In 2010, we really updated that to have a more frequent performance management focus and requiring the establishment of both cross-agency priority goals, as well as each of our agencies having about 3 or 4 priority goals. And one of the aspects of that became increasingly important that we've been able to leverage is not just the measurement methodologies and reporting, but we define the roles and responsibilities of key actors within our agencies, and then developed mechanisms by which we could bring them together on a regular basis. And importantly, one of the critical things we were able to do in 2016 was transition this framework from the previous administration to the current one. And that's the first time we had ever really been able to transition kind of frameworks across administrations to ensure some continuity, which I think for many of us who have worked in the center of government recognize just how critical having some of that continuity is. So in particular, one of the roles that we defined in the 2010 DIPRA Modernization Act was that of the deputy secretary or deputy minister within each of our agencies. We require that individual to not just be responsible for policy, but also be the agency's chief operating officer with responsibility for management, operations, and performance. That the law even specifically requires that person to at least quarterly lead data-driven in-person reviews of performance progress on each of the priority goals. Just to give you an example of the type of specificity that our legislation even went into in terms of clarifying the roles and responsibilities of those key actors. So OMB has, for almost 25 years now, regularly convened those deputy secretaries or chief operating officers through a mechanism of the President's Management Council. And usually those are monthly meetings to go over management reform initiatives and other administration priorities. So that group represents one of the most senior regularly recurring meetings in the federal government. And we were able to leverage that group to respond to this crisis in particular. Now, it's worth noting we have used that group in past kind of emergency situations, for instance, during our increasingly regular government shutdowns. Unfortunately, that group often is the one that we convene to work through policy and operations concerns. And we moved to, in the first days following the coronavirus pandemic, to actually having that group meet each day. So there was a daily rhythm, including on the weekends, for those groups to share information, ensure consistent communication, and get feedback on policy issues and other concerns that they wanted to be sure to address. We even stood up an internal collaboration site for members of that President's Management Council group to ensure dissemination of information in a clear, consistent way. So I really would point to that as a good example of something that we had built up using the performance framework, but we're able to redeploy it for this crisis situation that I think greatly assisted each of our agencies' efforts to respond to this crisis, while also preserving the flexibility they needed to adapt it to their own missions.
Muchas gracias, Dustin. Súper interesante.
Thank you, Dustin. Very interesting, this evolution and the role given to these vice ministers in the response to the crisis. Alejandra, we'll come back to you and tell us what was remaining. Tell us a little bit about the role of the compliance counseling unit in the coronavirus, and maybe a little bit of the dilemma that Leah spoke of between the delivery units that see the legacy or the mandate of the presidency, the 4-year mandate, and the firefighting, the momentary firefightings. Tell us a little bit of what was that like during the beginning of the pandemic.
Fue una reflexión que hicimos estructuralmente desde el comienzo de la pandemia. Porque, y además es una en que nos hemos tenido que mantener muy firmes. Voy a empezar con eso y después te cuento cuál es el rol específico que hemos jugado. ¿Por qué? Porque nosotros desde un principio, y esto es antes de la pandemia, nos hemos visto como el gran buque que tiene que mantener el norte hasta el 2022. Ahorita obviamente tenemos una pandemia que tiene unas consecuencias sin precedentes que ninguno de nosotros nos imaginábamos. Pero de todas maneras, pues antes de eso había protestas sociales, antes de eso, o sea, nuestros países sobre todo tienen una capacidad para tener unas crisis y unos picos en que los ministros y el presidente y muchas tienen que estar apagando esos incendios y justamente nuestro objetivo es poder mantener ese buque andando al 2022 y no perder ese norte. Entonces, cuando se vino la pandemia, la decisión que nosotros tomamos es, bueno, y obviamente esto es todo por solicitud del presidente y reflexionando con él, es nosotros como consejería no podemos atender la pandemia. Lo que tenemos es que preservar y tratar de mantener, obviamente con cierta sensibilidad, y ahorita te cuento cómo lo vamos a hacer, pero mantener esa visión hasta el 2022. Y eso ahorita está pasando mucho, por ejemplo, que los sectores nos piden, tenemos que cambiar las metas, tenemos que recalibrar, y los estamos acompañando a recalibrar las estrategias, pero todavía no estamos cambiando metas. Y las del 2022 definitivamente no, las del 2020 todavía no sabemos porque no, estamos en una bola de cristal. Entonces, hemos tenido que ha habido cierta tensión con los sectores, sobre todo los que sabemos que van a estar muy impactados, como lo que puede ser turismo.
Aquellos que sabemos que será.
Pues, pero tenemos que mantener esa calma y esa es como nuestra misionalidad como consejería. ¿Qué pasó? Apenas, digamos, se descubrió el primer caso acá y nosotros, de hecho, teníamos a una semana la asamblea del BID con 7,000 personas entrando a Barranquilla. Entra el segundo caso de COVID acá y decidimos, bueno, se cancela y tenemos que ponernos, digamos, 100% en cuestión de COVID. El presidente le pide a 2 o 3 ministros, que son los que tienen más experiencia como en gestión de crisis, entre ellas la ministra de Minas, María Fernanda Suárez, que arme como un SWAT team para ver.
To set it up as a SWAT team. And then I was
sino también pues como por la estructura que se necesita y la metodología de poder armar un plan de trabajo. Entonces,
methodology. So a strategic committee and a SWAT team were established. They lasted a week or 10 days. And in that SWAT team, we said we needed work line. There needs to be a work line of the inputs for doctors. We need a line for protocol. These are the things. And obviously one very important area for supply and shut down on protocols and an economic reactivation that Raquel mentioned. A strategic decision was made there that there needed to be one office focused only on COVID. And the president asked an ex-minister, Luis Guillermo Plata, to come and manage that unit. My role as advisor or structure lasts about 10 days until this person, Luis Guillermo Plata, was hired. In the strategic committee and also an operational committee, this is a kind of boardroom till the management was set up. The team was highly experienced in control, in having monitoring initiatives. So we loaned our staff from this office for that boardroom. When Del Plata came on and we had the COVID strategy, 2 people from my team went for a whole month to have this design work plans. And they focused on human resources. The doctors needed to take care of the pandemic. How are we going to be able to buy the respirators? And it was necessary to structure the work plans. And this has a lot to do with establishing a structure for what's going to happen in the future, and it needs to be coordinated with the Ministry of Health and other ministries that are involved in developing that plan. 1 month later, when it's all set up, the team was in place, the advisory department people returned to this office, and I think it was 1 or 2 weeks ago, I was asked, there's going to be a meeting of the board of directors that serves as a board for this department. It's a board that includes physicians, a former president of some banks. So it's a strategic board. And I was asked to join it as representative of the president and to ensure compliance and delivery. So these are the different aspects as far as structure and methodology. On the other hand, there was an exercise, it was very interesting actually, where we saw within the cross-cutting initiatives what needs to be accelerated to take care of the pandemic. So for instance, one initiative that Leah mentioned also is one for providing incentivation. We wanted to join databases about poverty at different entities. We had data in the planning department, a database at a different department, and all of this was being pulled together. This database was then used to be able to deploy the conditional cash transfers, not only to the population that were already in the social programs of the country, but now including vulnerable populations that were not yet in a program but that would be suffering highly when the economy shut down. So by using that database and that institutional or interagency coordination, it was possible to design a new program providing a conditional cash transfer to the vulnerable informal workers who had not been at that time in a social program. So that was one of the tools. Another tool is called, well, in Colombia, there's an initiative called the Law of the Endpoint. This is a law where some of the national government debts with the health departments was addressed, and we started to disperse all of this information. Anyway, that needed to be accelerated because the health area needed resources, so we used this tool to follow it closely. The third one, and I'm being very quick about this, it was an exercise with the president to identify in the cross-cutting actions which require more stress this year to ensure economic reactivation. So we recalibrated it all. We haven't removed all the cross-cutting measures, but we just chose which needed to be focused on in order to pull us out of the pandemic. Thank you very much, Ale. That was very interesting. It's impressive how the Colombian government leveraged the delivery unit's strengths in order to be able to strengthen their response to the crisis. Let me move on to Raquel now. Raquel, in Brazil, like in Colombia, there's a strong planning perspective, and it's included since 2019 in the Ministry of Economy. The question for you is then, what's the difference between the delivery unit of approach? What change does it bring when compared to the traditional view of planning? Mariano.
I wouldn't really talk so much about the
but
difference, but in the fact that they are complementary. The two tools are complementary. So when we started working on this delivery unit and the work we did, COVID-19 didn't yet exist, and the work that we had was to take our strategic planning aspect, and let me explain that a little bit to you. We had our strategic planning already done from 2019 to 22. That was already structured with a value chain, with a map of strategic goals, different projects, and a host of strategic indicators. Now, for you to understand our map of targets, there are 12 strategic targets, and the size of the Ministry of the Economy and all the different areas that we have, really, there are 4 different ministries. That is that of planning, finance, labor, and industry and commerce. That make up this whole approach to the economy, 4 ministries. And so we brought them all together, defining 2 overarching strategic goals, and that really required an effort of prioritization. And so our initial idea was for us to, based on that work of prioritizing areas, we had to choose some of these points to then place in the delivery unit, because as we understood it, the delivery unit was where we would be working on trying to speed up the production of results. And so I've got the 4-year planning targets, and then I had to select particular areas to speed this up, focusing on different areas. So I've got the planning, and I've got the formal planning cycle of monthly monitoring and the quarterly assessment. Now, in the delivery unit, this is a weekly decision-making process that we had to get that churning a lot faster so that we could arrive at the results that we wanted. So that was our initial plan. Now, as it turned out, when COVID struck, we weren't able to continue under that same plan, and so we focused the effort of the delivery unit on the priorities that were defined in response to COVID, but following the same rationale. 163 different measures. I can't lose sight of those measures, and so we had our 2019-2022 plan, overarching plan that we had to stick with, and then we have our emergency strategy vis-a-vis COVID. That would be just for 2020. These are two parallel strategies that ran side by side this year. And then, on top of that, we take out some of these measures, which are the ones that we are focusing on within the delivery unit.
Planejamentos formais,
Usando a misma lógica,
toda uma conexão com a lógica de prestação de contas para os órgãos de controle.
Be accountable to the controlling.
Com os resultados, eu tenho que também trabalhar em paralelo para agilizar resultados, mas pensando em como eu formalizo tudo isso para, no final, conseguir chegar, por exemplo, num relatório de gestão ou numa prestação de contas do presidente da República mais à frente. E aí, mais uma vez, a gente tem mais um complicador no ano de 2020, porque eu tenho que ter uma prestação de contas que dê conta dessas duas estratégias que coexistem ao longo de 2020. Okay.
Muchas gracias, Raquel. Súper interesante esta complementación que va en línea también un poco.
Thank you very much, Raquel. This is extremely interesting, and it ties in with what Alejandra was saying about Colombia. It is to have an existing planning, but emphasizing current. Dustin, can you hear the interpretation now?
Yes.
Además de tu trabajo en OMB,
in addition to your work at OMB that you spoke about earlier, you chair a public governance committee at the OECD, and that's quite an important position. So taking advantage of your position and your contact with other people in other countries outside of Latin America through the OECD, could you share with us some of the examples how other countries have been working the issue? How have they used their government centers or their delivery units or whatever to respond to the crisis?
Sure. Thank you for that. And yeah, it is a real honor to be able to work with so many countries, both OECD member countries, but also an increasing number of non-member countries who are playing a very active role in the OECD, in particular the Public Governance Committee. For instance, I think in our April spring meeting, we had over 200 people attend the virtual session, which actually in many ways kind of created even more opportunities for people to engage in the, I think, increasingly important work of the Public Governance Committee, which, as you know, has 9 different sub-bodies that range from the workforce to integrity to digital issues, budget issues as well. So it's pretty wide-ranging. So I want to give a special thanks and shout out to the colleagues at the OECD Secretariat, Edwin Lau, Stefan Jacobson as well, who have been doing a good job pulling together country examples almost in real time and making those increasingly available. So I think they'll be coming out with a number of reports that try to provide kind of country case studies and summaries that I think will be helpful for us to leverage, not just in this, immediate kind of dealing with the crisis, but obviously there's going to be a long road for recovery that we need to take stock of that will be important to share lessons learned over the coming weeks, months, and even years as we deal with the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. So I think I just maybe kind of highlight three themes that we've seen emerge. One is what sort of decision-making structures the center of government has established, and in particular, the OECD countries have done a few different things. On the one hand, they've leveraged existing structures to manage the crisis, and then they've also, in many cases, put in place temporary or kind of ad hoc structures that have been newly created. And then, you know, in many countries in the US and UK in particular, Lithuania, they've done a hybrid approach in that they've, you know, established some new, but also leveraged some existing. You know, for instance, in the first category, Sweden has a crisis management council that's been in place for a while under their Ministry of the Interior. Italy also has a civil protection department under the Prime Minister's office that's already been established. You also see the creation of new structures like in France or in Latvia. Singapore established a task force chaired by both the Ministry for National Development and the Minister for Health. So bringing two different kind of key ministries together is an important attribute of what they were able to do. Obviously, you know, in the US, we've had a vice president leading a White House task force, which is a new structure. But as I mentioned before, we've also leveraged the existing structures like the President's Management Council, so more of a hybrid approach. So that maybe gives you a little sense on the decision-making. In terms of communication, I think that's another area the center of government has played a really critical role. Different groups have been established. For instance, in the UK, they established a rapid response unit to tackle disinformation. Italy has also done the same in the center of government. And, you know, Spain has informed the public on scientific advances and possible hoaxes and rumors that may arise based on advice from its scientific analysis group. So I think that's an increasingly critical role. I know, for instance, in the center of government meeting that I attended in Iceland last fall, which seems like years ago now, that was one of the big focus points was how to deal with communication from the center of government, especially in an era of disinformation. So I think that is an increasingly kind of important role that center of governments are focused on. Obviously, having some sort of data and analytics group is going to be increasingly important too, as we get to kind of a third area that I'd highlight, which is how do you transition from the crisis level decision-making processes toward the more long-term sustainable decision-making processes, and what data and information do you have to make available so that people have the best evidence possible to inform their decisions around health and economic considerations. In the United States, for instance, we have enabled our health ministry's data and information system, which pulls information from state and local governments and a wide variety of other places to be available to decision makers in all federal agencies at the kind of senior most level, so that we are ensuring a consistent set of information that's more broadly available and not requiring each ministry to develop its own data collection capabilities and potentially also have conflicting kind of information sources. So I do think that's a critical role for the center of government to play, even if that data doesn't reside in the center of government. Using the center of government to develop the rules and access for other people to gain access to information that may exist in one ministry, that's still a very critical role that a delivery unit or a center of government can help facilitate.
Muchas gracias, Dustin. Súper interesante. Y ese punto que mencionas.
Thank you very much, Dustin. Extremely interesting. And that what you said about analytics and data is really a key matter. I think in Latin America, we're lagging in that a little bit. Dustin, perhaps you could mute your microphone. You haven't muted it yet. Let us now move to the third question. It's a general question for all three of you. What are the next steps in your delivery units in Colombia, at the Consejería, in the delivery unit at the Ministry of Economy of Brazil, and performance.gov, or the performance management in the United States? What needs to be improved? What is the crisis teaching you? What that you didn't think about before? Just briefly, in 3 minutes each. Thank you. 3 minutes. Okay, here I go. Let me read from my notes that might help me be quicker. This is an extremely important question. Part of the learning of being able to achieve a delivery unit that's useful to the country, no delivery unit is going to be the same. We have learned this because it depends on the structure of the country. It depends on even of the personality of the government, head of government. And it has to do also with the juncture, despite the fact you want to have a long-term view. So we are learning continuously, learning from past experiences, learning from the United States and from lots of other entities in order to continue strengthening monitoring tools, and especially the great value added from the delivery unit in our case is to support sectors and empower them, because they are the ones who actually execute. We just support them, but we are not the controller. Rather, we have to help them in problem solving. And that, I think, is the extremely important thing the delivery unit can do, but there needs to be trust. So we have to work hand in hand with them. We can't work on our own from presidency. If there is rejection from sectors or rejection from the territories, things will not work. So we are continuously improving the methodology, improving communication. A major challenge that we have right now is to establish the office, to strengthen the team. We have a fantastic team right now. Find the right monitoring tools and to provide these loans and face these challenges, such as the information and the data analytics system that Dustin mentioned is a dream for us, and we'd like to establish it. But we have this communication challenge. Who is our public? Our public is the president, actually, but we also have a wealth of information, and we need to see how we can ensure transparency and communicate to the community. That is perhaps one of the most important challenges. Then there's the challenge of communicating the tools and the information systems, and we need to deploy the capabilities we've built, deploy them into the other sectors. So we have a large department that we will be deploying, and we need to adapt to the tools used by the 18 ministries in Colombia so that they can have their own delivery units. That's one of the commitments that we hope to achieve in the near term. For me, how, as a public official and in the advisory department, and what we've learned from COVID, it has taught us the lesson drawn. Obviously, this has been a very difficult situation for the country and for the world. The number of deaths and the economic chasm that we're facing. But planning tools and leadership have been key to not fall precisely in that fear of putting out fires instead of looking at the big picture. So we have been able to provide these tools for monitoring and to structure plans. It's value added, and we need to continue working on it. My dream is that everyone, as Dustin said, well, the challenge for us is that there's continuous learning. They've seen it in the public sector. Now we're looking at it in the public sector. There could be radical changes in government, different administrations. But we want to leave tools that a new administration can take on board. We'll be ensuring monitoring, transparency, traceability, allowing Colombia to have management strength that does not depend on the administration at the time or the minister who was in office at that time. So that is our goal. Thank you. That's excellent, Alejandra. Before I give the floor to Raquel, let me remind you that you can send questions for the panelists. We have received some, but please put them in the Q&A. You'll see it on the foot of your screen. Raquel.
Well, Mariano, as you said, our delivery unit is the newest one, right? So the most recent one. So we still have a lot to develop. And I believe that in those few months that we had, we were able to establish and to evolve a lot in this defining our monitoring capabilities of our results. But I also believe that we have three main points that we still need to develop. The first one, I would say, which is a problem-solving cycle. Say, I can gather data, I can analyze data, but I need to improve my solution approach and my decision making. So we can send a report, so those that will make the decision making, but I believe that this still can be improved, can be enhanced in two ways, I would say, for the superior administrative level, and we can also improve it working all these capabilities within those specific administrative sectors. So this is the first topic. The second topic here in Brazil, and this didn't happen on purpose, but we are prioritizing certain things that are defining certain segments in certain secretaries. And probably one of the main things of the delivery unit that we can talk about transversal challenges or capabilities, if you will. So if we can define priorities that are more transversal, that we can provide and have a better way to articulate, this is another topic that I would like to discuss in the following months. And this third topic that I would also like to work in the future has to do with development performance indicators. And why is that? Because currently we are using performance indicators for COVID-19 that are linked to efficiency. And I'm going to give you an example. Right now, we are trying to measure in terms of the financial volume, the one that it's the small and medium companies are trying to get credit in the bank. So why are we doing that? But this is within our approach to preserve the job. So what do I want? The people to not lose their jobs. So that indicator, it is an efficiency indicator, and my effective indicator is the job taxes, or if you will. So what I want is to know how many people are asking for credit with banks. So you can have a comparison in terms of the volume, credit volume that I had imagined for that line of credit, and actually how many small and medium companies are actually getting credit. But I need to know how this is showing that a lot of less people are losing their jobs. And I would say that those are the three main topics that we can improve within our delivery units here in Brazil.
Thank you very much, Raquel. That was 3 minutes, 5 seconds. Perfect. Let us now move to Dustin. What's next for you?
Great. Yeah, and thank you for mentioning the performance.gov site. That is really kind of our one-stop shop. If anyone wants more information about the performance work, we really invested a lot in that and have seen actually significant increases in our traffic to that site over the past couple years. So we're feeling good about where that stands as a kind of good platform to tell the government story. And not just the good, but also kind of being honest about where we have challenges, which I think is an important attribute if we're going to gain the public's and other key stakeholders' trust. And I would really focus on that topic kind of above all else, which is trust in government. As I think Alejandra mentioned that as well. That kind of bridges some of the OECD and US efforts that I've been engaged in most recently. The OECD Public Governance Committee identified trust in government as the primary outcome of public governance work. And as we renewed the mandate for the Public Governance Committee over the next 5 years, you know, in particular, when we look at what the drivers of trust are, I think it speaks very well to where we should be focusing, both in respect to this crisis, but also about regular kind of government operations that are separate. I think I saw a recent McKinsey study that suggested 67% of people's trust in government can be explained by their individual interactions and satisfaction with and experiences with public services. So I think that gives us a pretty powerful set of evidence on where we should be focused from the center of government. If we're not just in the immediate crisis, where often trust in our institutions is often high, but in the recovery phase, where it can be much more challenging to organize our ministries and our leadership to stay focused on those things that really are going to drive strong, positive engagement with customers and beneficiaries of government services. And I think that is one of the key opportunities for roles of delivery units. The center of government traditionally is very good at top-down change management and putting policies out and requiring some accountability. I'd say what they're less strong at often is how we get feedback from the front lines up to decision makers. And I think that's one of the roles that delivery units in particular can play. And one of the things we've been working hard at in the United States. For instance, we have identified the 25 programs that have the highest touch points with citizens. Think of an airport or student loans or national parks. 25 high impact service providers, and they have a maturity model for how they're going to improve the use of customer feedback in their operations. That's, I think, going to be increasingly critical to the future, not just kind of as we respond to coronavirus, but also just in general as we try to keep up with leading private sector practices that the public has come to expect in terms of ability to deliver effectively and efficiently. And I'd also add in employee surveys too. So finding out information from our own workforce and the customers we serve, and do we have good mechanisms to get that information on a regular basis up to the center of government is a big place that we're going to be focused on in the coming weeks and months ahead.
Muchas gracias, Dustin, este punto de la confianza y del resultado.
Thank you, Dustin. This question of the trust and the final result that Raquel also mentioned as very important of the final value of these management models, which in the end, that's what really matters from the governments. Thank you all three for these excellent responses. And we're now going to go with Edgardo Mosqueira, who's going to make a few comments. We still are getting a few questions, or maybe after Edgardo, we're going to share these questions with the panelists. Edgardo? Thank you, Mariano. And thank you to all the panelists. Very interesting thoughts about the development of the delivery units, which basically make us think of how these have evolved in the last 10 years in the region. I'd like to highlight a few topics that have been mentioned, which I think are very relevant. Alejandra used a series of very interesting terms to describe the role of the delivery units. For example, she said that the delivery unit in Colombia had a periscopic vision, seeking how to identify complex and priority issues that respond to the most vulnerable and are usually multi-sectoral. This is very important because it shows that the delivery units are focusing more and more on seeing the most important priorities. The other important term that she used was that the delivery unit uses a prospective traffic light, not with red lights, but with yellow lights to see where we can actually see the problem and try to resolve it or to help resolve it in advance. And the other interesting thing, which was mentioned by Alejandra, which was also mentioned by Raquel, is the complementarity of the delivery unit that should not be replacing the existing units, but to add to their work and to help them reach the strategic objectives that are so important. Another important topic mentioned by Alejandra, which I think is a challenge that all delivery units are assuming, is the use of data. Alejandra and Raquel both explained very clearly that the use of data basically allows them to work with transparency and traceability and to generate evidence-based policies, which is very important and something which that has been promoted a lot by the IDB and has been included in the Colombian project that Alejandra referred to. And it's the best way to actually be able to make these policies actually be evidence-based. Dustin added to this in an interesting way by pointing to the fact that the delivery unit could play a facilitating role for the data collection from the different sources. There's a very good example that Alejandra mentioned, I believe, of the collecting of data from the different agencies so that the data can actually serve us focus on the delivery of services. And Dustin mentioned that the delivery unit could play an important role to support the implementation of data access so that they could actually be shared and used to follow up on the priorities and define policies and basically in the general government work. Raquel mentioned something which Dustin also referred to, which is the importance of communications. One of the themes that we've been evaluating at the IDB as the next step for the delivery units in Latin America, understanding that the communications role from the government center is important, and that from the government center, the delivery unit should try to promote some type of mechanism that actually makes this communication serve to first communicate the objective of the government, the priorities and the progress, but also to eliminate fake information due to the expansion of the social networks, which tend to confuse citizens. And the final item that I'd like to highlight refers to the last thoughts of Dustin regarding trust in the government. We've seen as an outcome of the pandemic that in Latin America and the rest of the world, citizens have turned back to look towards the states to ask, what are the states doing to resolve the problem of the pandemic? And this is very interesting because, as Dustin said, this generates an opportunity for the state to reinstate the contract with citizens based on better services, as Dustin mentioned in his presentation. A very high percentage of the impression of trust of citizens is based on those services. So I really believe that we have a wonderful opportunity in the region to advance in strengthening the government centers so that they can offer better services to improve the citizens' trust in the governments. Thank you, Mariano. Thank you, Edgardo. That was excellent and a wonderful summing up. And we're now going to go to the questions that we received and the comments. I'm going to read them. Some are geared directly to the panelists, others are general. So I ask the panelists to make note of those that you may think you might answer in general so that you can add them to your presentations. First, we have a question which I think is more to me from Marcelo Barros, Vice Minister of Casa Civil in Brazil, who asks, how can the government centers work in a more integrated manner in Latin America? Would it be timely at this time to consider the recovery in the region? Thank you, Marcelo, for participating. Thank you for your question. And from the IDB side, we will be organizing a virtual regional meeting of government centers, hopefully in the second semester of this year, more towards the end of the second semester. So we'll keep you informed. But I believe that events like these and these chats and exchange of informations are in that line. So thank you very much. We also received a few comments and questions from Stefan Jacobson from the OECD, mentioned by Dustin, that in fact shared some practices of the OECD in his comments as well. The question is, it's a good opportunity to support on the existing structures and teams to respond to the crisis, or do you think that in your countries it's been better to innovate, to adapt to the emergency with more ad hoc responses? That's the first question. That's a general question for all of you. The next question we heard from Carlos Antiso from CAF, who asks Dustin specifically, one of the main assets of the delivery units is the information or data that you have access to, and how do you manage it to do your work? How challenging has it been to access that information of performance throughout the government, particularly in autonomous entities and local governments? How has this changed in recent years during the data revolution? And asks, is the role of a delivery unit, or should it be integrated into the chief data analytical officers? That's a question from Carlos, which I think applies to Raquel a little bit as well, and maybe as Alejandra as well, regarding the challenges you've seen of receiving data from the ministries and governments. No, he corrects, of autonomous institutions and subnational governments to do their work. And Miguel Porrua, a colleague from the IDB, also asked something similar. Are the data from the private sector being used in these delivery units for the use of data? And I would like to share 2 or 3 more questions with you. One from Paula Suarez from the World Bank. Thank you, Paula, for being with us today. And in a context of such complex topics and such uncertainty like COVID, do you think that having a structure like this of the delivery units or these management models would help politicians to make more complex decisions that could be polemic? Do they feel more supported, having the support of other parts of the government with these models? And finally, another question deals with the relationship with the subnational governments. And particularly for Alejandra, how do you coordinate the response to the pandemic with the municipalities? Have there been routines installed like with the mayor's office? And if not, what type of work do you have in the delivery units, the relationship, in other words, with the mayors? And the final question from Jairo Acuña is, how do you consider your delivery units add to legitimacy and trust from the citizens towards the government institutions, particularly in the operations of the executive? I leave you to respond to the questions you believe you'd like to respond to based on your experience, and we'll start in the same order: Alejandra, Raquel, and then Dustin. Thank you, Mariano. Very interesting questions, actually. Let me see, I'm going to try to answer them all from my point of view, if I may, and then I'll give the floor to Raquel after that. Insofar as innovating to adapt to the emergency, yes, actually, this is a world situation and a situation we've never lived ever in the country or in the world. I don't know who I was talking to about a month ago about the role of the counseling unit or the government in general vis-a-vis pandemic is that it's something that's broken all models. I mean, to try to base yourself on a simulation model like the ones that we had originally, like from the Royal College, and that would be impossible. I mean, we've not been able to base ourselves on these structures because this is something we've never seen before. We don't know how it's going to develop, and it depends on how it develops in each country. So I think that we definitely have to innovate. The problem is that what I think is key is that we should not only innovate, we should base ourselves on the learning, the best practices, leadership structures, so that we can prepare a work plan that's flexible and capable of navigating this crisis. So I think we have to establish a balance. And that's why I was referring to that last question that Mariano asked me of the fact that fortunately we already had a type of follow-up structure with databases and information so that we could manage this navigation, and a president like Ivan Duque, who actually assumed a strong leadership from the very beginning of the pandemic so that he could actually, and one of his emblematic themes has been to have a television program at the end of the day, every day, telling what's happened, what are the things that have happened, and have this open communication channel informing the citizens of what's happening. But this can be done if we have the appropriate structures, the COVID management, the health ministry responding, and a series of activities and coordination within the government that allows us to have structures like the delivery units in general. We play a tangential role, of course, but these delivery units could play an important role in this as well. As for the challenge to obtain the data, I believe that Carlos Santizo, nice to say hello to you. In our case, we're still seeing how we're going to centralize the information within the system that we're setting up with the IDB credit. But what happens is, and this is a big challenge, and I think it's interesting to hear the reaction of the other panelists, is that We have in Colombia, for example, a certified database, which is Sinergia, which is the planning from the National Planning Department. Since it's certified, it's transparent for the population and it has all the data. It has to be true and validated. And that makes it that makes them delayed, while you have the immediate data that all ministers have and they want to show the president as a result, which are not validated with Sinergia, because the president actually wants to know right now how many houses have been built. He wants to know immediately how many hectares of the irrigation are being worked on. So he needs to have the immediate information. How many students are currently enrolled? All of these are immediate data, but they're not validated. So we still don't know what we're going to do. I don't think we're going to be able to be based on the Sinergia certified data to have the information in real time, but we're going to have that asterisk, which we put on all reports saying that we're using the third-party databases, but subject to validation of the National Planning Department. This is a very important aspect vis-a-vis the immediacy of the data and the validity of the certified data, which I believe that in being in the delivery unit, working between the prospective and the retrospective, we're always going to have to establish a balance. But I do think it's important to see what the other panelists have to say about this. We use data from the private sector. Yes, in the economy initiatives, for example, like a very important one, which I think is key, which is the entrepreneurial formalization, where we use the data from the chambers of commerce. We have a very fluid regulation with the chambers of commerce, particularly with the president of Confecámaras, of the country's chambers of commerce. And we do have a lot of information from the private sector, which we do not have as the public sector. And we do make use of it to make recommendations. When we have the system, I don't know if we're going to adapt or stick to it, or it's going to be from the Ministry of Trade. But we do work with a lot of information from the private sector. And do the politicians feel supported when making decisions? Well, let me tell you, that's a very interesting question, which deals with the transformational initiative, which we have in the unit, which is the multi-purpose registration or cadastre. It's the registry for everyone, which can have an updated image of what the territory is like. And it's a key central basis for policy decisions, planning decisions, whatever. It's fundamental. And also for the economic strengthening of the municipalities. But of course, vis-a-vis the pandemic right now, to invest in hospitals or to invest in registration, obviously, there's no question. They have to resolve the more immediate crisis right now. And we're doing didactic work with them, recommending the importance of investing in the registration, because in the end, that may be the best, and midterm, it's going to be the best for the municipality. And they're going to be seeing the investment in that as a solution for them. So I really believe that that support as a priority for the president and as a priority from the presidency, and we're going to be supporting them in that decision, which may be difficult. Yes, it will help them make more complicated decisions if they realize that it's a transformational policy of the president. In the case of the work with the mayors, as a mission and regarding the pandemic, the work with the mayors is done with the Ministry of the Interior, the health secretariats, and so forth. But we have spaces with the mayors to explain certain policies, to arrive at certain decisions, but it's not something that's definitely set up as a direct channel with the mayors. It's something that would be done maybe through the presidency, because otherwise then I believe that we might lose the sight of our course. It's not that we don't respond to their needs. It's not that we don't have open spaces for conversations with them and maybe virtual meetings to talk to them, but it is not institutionalized, let me say. And finally, does this give the citizens legitimacy for the, well, I would say yes. And eventually, and here, I don't know what's going to happen from now until 2022, but I think that there would be a layer of transparency of the delivery units directly for the citizens, where we'd be able to report how we're doing, what's happening through some website, some direct communication. I think that that would give it the legitimacy. showing what we're doing as transformational priorities. But we're in the process of development. I mean, we've only been in existence for about a year, which is not much. But I do think that we're working with the idea of giving it the legitimacy and transparency for the citizens. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alejandra.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. Those are excellent thoughts. Raquel, please.
I'm going to answer 3 of the questions that were raised that were general nature on the issue of innovation and decision-making processes. Certainly, we did have to innovate some of our mechanisms for decision-making. The emergency assistance, for example, for vulnerable groups, and also to save jobs from being lost. But there are 2 different areas that I would like to underscore. One is that the pandemic also created an opportunity to speed up some of the projects that we already had. So we had projects to help small business.
We had a credit for small, medium companies, and they gain more relevance. And this was implemented quicker because of the pandemic. And then at the same time, some of the projects that perhaps would have stopped right now, again, because of the pandemic, they were still relevant. I'm going to give you an example. We had a lot of political reforms in the process, and over the pandemic, we will have back the fiscal reform, but we have an initial plan that we're not going to die because of the pandemic, if you will. So as I said before, we have 2 strategic planning working together, but all the reform, the political reforms, will come back after we overcome the pandemic. Another question that I was presented with was the relationship with the private sector. Yes, we do have a relationship with the private sector. One secretary that we have, which is the Secretary for Competitiveness, Productivity, and Jobs. And they started right in the beginning, the established relationship channel that was called We Are Gonna Win, which is a website for the relationship with the private sector, that we will get requests, demands from the private sector, things they wanted us to establish, to change in order to survive over the pandemic period. And once our Minister of the Economy will implement certain measures, we will then inform the private sector so that they could then implement their business following some kind of norms that we established. So we were able to establish some kind of communication channel, if you will, with the private sector. In another question that was we just how to inspire a trust with a citizen. And this is something that they're working right now, which is try to expand transparency with the results of our delivery unities. We are going to have a meeting, our executive secretary, so to show how can we use our follow-up of all these measures and all the follow-up of all these monitoring indicators, how can we show this publicly in our website so that any citizen can log in and can see exactly what is going on, what is happening, how the Ministry of Economy is implementing some measures. So it is something that will be available for the citizen and also for the press to use and then to disseminate the information if they want to. So this has not been implemented yet, but our goal it is in the short term to implement this. So these, I think, well, the main questions, I think I covered them up.
Thank you, Raquel. Excellent points. And this ties in very neatly with what Alejandra pointed out when speaking about communication, also mentioned by Alejandro. Dustin, before I give you the floor, let me add 2 additional questions for you. And I do believe that your experience in the United States will allow you to answer easily. First, what institutional instruments do you manage to generate incentives so that institutions, sectors, ministries, departments are institutionally aligned and are able to perform in line with what the government seeks? How can ensure that the departments cooperate with the general goals? Second question, what do you recommend to solidify this management system that it will last over time, regardless of changes? This is a little bit in line with what Alejandra was pointing out. And perhaps in the United States, with the changes of administration and styles and political parties, etc., can be maintained and consolidated over time as far as the model goes. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So just in two reactions to the questions that we received, and good to hear from Carlos as well. Appreciate his question. On the question of do you leverage existing versus new institutions, I think there's always a tough balance there. You know, my experience is creating new institutions are often challenging to maintain. So whenever you can leverage an existing and adjust the mandate, it seems like that has had more success in my experience. Though, as Alejandra said, this in particular situation has broken all of the models and scenarios that many of us had prepared for. So you certainly don't want to be limited to that. I think looking forward, recognizing we'll have a long road for recovery ahead of us, identifying where those gaps are, and I think will be very critical, whether that's with relationships with subnational governments, whether that's the critical relationships between the executive and legislative bodies, or even just the gaps between the people we're serving, the customers themselves, and where we kind of hear about their customer journeys, which is one of the things we've been focused more and more on. How do you take a journey of a citizen that has to navigate through maybe different programs and better understand what that looks like from their standpoint, get people in the center of government, for instance, who understand the principles of human-centered design and are bringing those sorts of perspectives to the forefront, I think is absolutely critical to success. I talked to colleagues in Germany yesterday who had done some work by bringing in citizens into meetings and hearing directly from them, which is something I think that could be very powerful to help us rethink maybe the way we design our programs and our experiences. Second point on data access, just my one quick reaction on that is it does require some central capacity. Data capabilities are much beyond what we would have imagined, you know, even a few years ago, and the ease at which we can get data and information and the sophisticated tools we have are really extraordinary and give us an unbelievable ability to kind of see into what's happening on the front lines in ways that we have never traditionally got through the management reporting hierarchy structures where bad news rarely travels up through organizations in my experience. So data really gives you a chance to reset that expectation. However, I would caution, I think the idea of creating information from a supply driven, if we put it out there, surely folks will find it helpful. You know, doesn't always have a great track record, and really figuring out what's the demand driven model. How are we going to use this information and make decisions? And then how can we make that transparent to the public versus just putting it out and kind of hoping people will access it. I think that's always been a guiding principle we've tried to have, is how do you have more demand-driven processes, not just supply-driven. On your two questions, Mariano, what incentives have we put in place? We have gone back and forth. We've tried different things in the US, from red, yellow, green kind of stoplight incentives to more recently actually trying to use the power of storytelling as a way of creating incentives. We have put in place something called the Gears of Government Awards program, where we've recognized over 200 civil servants that have made kind of innovative improvements in mission, service, or stewardship goals for their agency, You can see those awards on our website, on the performance.gov website, if you're interested. It's a very actually low cost effort. We ask each of our ministries to run a process at each of our interagency councils to identify individuals, and then a subset are often awarded the President's Award, and we do a ceremony. Being able to tell that story about that civil servant who's gone above and beyond is powerful, and I think a very important way for us to be able to create incentives and model the behaviors you want others to adopt, which is, is one of the core ways that you do put in place change management practices in government. So I would encourage folks to take a look at that Years of Government Awards program and the way we've done that. Final thing of how we get this institutionalized, I really look to those senior career officials, right? And do they engage with the routines that you've put in place because they have to, or because they're actually seeing value and bought in? And I think having regular dialogue and getting feedback from them of what's working and what's not, has this become too burdensome? What's the value proposition? So that you can take those into account, especially during transitions, is really important. I know I always try to have those conversations with senior career officials who are critical to institutionalizing in this sort of time period when we're getting ready for a transition. Regardless of the outcome of the election that is going to happen this fall, there will be a transition. So that's usually a good opportunity to get that feedback from your senior career colleagues and be able to adjust the routines based on that feedback to ensure there's buy-in and support from the folks who are going to be critical to driving it into a next term or next administration.
Excelentes puntos, Dustin.
Excellent points, Dustin. Truly excellent. Raquel, Alejandra, also. I'd like to thank all three of the speakers. I'd like to thank Leah and Ricardo also. At the IDB, we have learned very much from listening to you and your ideas, and that will help us supporting other governments in Latin America and the Caribbean in this topic. We will soon distribute a link with the recording. You'll also find it available in podcasts. Perhaps for some of you that is more friendly to use. It will be available in the 3 languages. We'll contact you soon also for upcoming webinars on public management at the IDB. So thank you all very much and see you next time.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mariano.
Obrigada, pessoal. Tchau, tchau.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mariano.
Thank you so much.
You
Bye-bye
all.
now.
Goodbye. Goodbye to everyone.